Welcome back to Decouple. I'm very excited about today's episode, in which we're going to be delving into the lessons of America's nuclear construction history from its heydays in the 1970s and 80s to the drawing up of new orders to lessons learned from Vogel and how it should all inform America's thinking about nuclear construction going forward. And to break it all down, I'm very excited to welcome first-time Decouple guest, James Krellenstein, to the podcast. A warm welcome, James.
Thanks so much, Chris.
So, James, well, I was going to say James is, and I've been doing a bit of searching on you, and it's a bit of a black hole on the old Google search. What I know about you is that we are both on a WhatsApp group called Arcane Nuclear Beefs, where you're much more active than I am. Your Twitter profile mentions that you are a physicist. But to be honest, I did a little Google searching, and I could find a few quotes attributed in articles about, I think, Russian nuclear fuel supply issues, but very little else. How do you manage to keep such a low profile on Google? And who the hell are you, James Krellenstein?
It's a really good question. So, I'm a physicist by training, as you just mentioned. But I spent the last 10 years not in the nuclear energy sector at all. I worked actually a lot in biomedical sort of countermeasure development and production and deployment, particularly on HIV, COVID-19, of course, when that happened, and monkeypox and some other high consequence pathogens like Marburg virus and Sudan virus. And I did that a lot from an advocacy perspective as well. But, my dad's a nuclear engineer. I sort of grew up in, immersed in and with a very big love for nuclear engineering. I spent my 8th birthday party at a nuclear power plant, which I will not name, that actually let me in to the actual plant as an 8-year-old, which is not certainly not in accordance with regulatory requirements at that time. Hence, reason why I won't name it even now. I spent my childhood in my basement, which was filled with blueprints of nuclear power plants and critical path simulations of construction for nuclear plants. And, my father, after leaving the industry, he worked at Abasco before he left, building St. Lucie Unit Number 2, Washington Nuclear Project 3 and 5. He did regulatory work on San Onofre Units 2 and 3 and South Texas Project Units 1 and 2. He also headed up the JP Morgan Chase's Energy Environmental Group before he retired. So I sort of grew up in an environment where, I'd have dinners with nuclear engineering professors, heads of utilities. It was just sort of the world I was immersed in, and the family debates were about the adequacy of the Mark I containment for the boiling water reactor. And then about a couple of months ago, I decided to jump back into the nuclear space. And I've been doing some consulting work with a advocacy firm called GHS Climate, and we've been focusing on how do we get off of Russian uranium enrichment capacity and services. And we did a big white paper, a big analysis that I headed up that was actually the basis of a front page New York Times story just back in June. And we're doing a lot of other consulting work, some of which I can't really talk about at this point. But that is sort of where I sort of entered into the space from about a couple months ago.
Amazing. Well, my fifth date with my girlfriend was actually to the Bruce Nuclear Power Station. And also Western Waste Management. So we, held hands and walked amongst the dry cask containers. It was very romantic. And I'm sure your birthday party was equally as exciting. I hope to get my son.
Yeah, it was a different type of yellow cake for my.
I hope to get my son into a nuclear power plant. I'll try and beat your age.
It's much harder after September 11th. Let me tell you.
I can only imagine. Okay, so I think that's a great introduction, and you obviously were a child who didn't spend a ton of time rebelling against your parents or your father. At least it sounds like you had a lot of respect for him, paid a lot of attention. That's remarkable in and of itself.
I mean, we fought.
Right.
I remember,
over the Mach 1 containment system, or
Nurag 1150 at various family debates. But yeah, sure.
Love it. All right, so let's get on to what we're here to do. And I'm really excited to have you on again because there's so much excitement now about a potential nuclear renaissance. There's a number of different approaches that have been taken historically. Differing layers of state involvement and sort of curation of nuclear buildouts in the past. I've still on a pretty simplistic set of frames, I think, myself. But generally speaking, there's been a pretty strong role for government in coordination of nuclear buildouts. But I'm not sure if you would agree with us that the U.S. is sort of the furthest from that in their historical approach. As we look into the future, we're looking at best models as well. I was trying to track down this tweet from Jennifer Granholm prior to this episode, but essentially it was saying, listen, the way that the Russians and Chinese do this is a great big state-backed enterprise, tons of vertical integration. That's not how we do things in America. We're going to sprinkle some money on some advanced, innovative reactor companies and let the wonders of the market rule. So I'm interested in learning from the past and applying lessons to the future. With all that in mind, I'm not sure where exactly you would like to get started, but let's go back to like the 60s, 70s, if that works for you.
Or maybe actually ask this question about the role of government. Maybe we should go back to the 50s and late 40s and think about why do we have pressurized water reactors and boiling water reactors that represent the vast majority of the global fleet and right now 100% of the US's power generation fleet. And the reason, comes back to two big U.S. government programs, right? That we're not actually out of weapons production, right? There's some recent confusion about this, but instead, in the case of pressurized water reactors, really came out of the Navy, right? And the need for Navy nuclear propulsion. And we had Hyman Rickover and his team, really develop the first pressurized water reactor up in Idaho, right? Working actually alongside Westinghouse in developing that technology, which led first to the Nautilus, but then to the first sort of nuclear power plant at Shippingport. But that was really the genesis of that as a practical power generation system, right? Was really genesis in the Navy and the Navy nuclear propulsion program. And then the boiling water reactors come out of something completely different, right? Boiling water reactors, for various reasons, are not very good at the Navy, right? Not very good on shipborne power sources, but came out of a series of experiments done by Argonne National Lab, although actually at that time in Idaho, called the borax experiments, where we actually answered this basic question: can a boiling water reactor ever be stable? And there's some interesting nuclear physics reasons why you would think it wouldn't be stable. And the borax experiments 1 through 5 prove that this actually is very stable and can be self-regulating. We actually even exploded catastrophically Borax 5, the reactor, in the Idaho desert. Some great footage you can track down on YouTube. But it was out of those two major government programs that when we worked alongside commercial companies in a very U.S. government post-World War II method, where the USG would do the prototype plants and then identify a commercial partner, at first Westinghouse for the PWRs and General Electric for the boiling water reactors, out of those government programs that launched the genesis of the nuclear power fleet that powers almost, obviously not in Canada, not some other exceptions, almost all of the global nuclear power generation capacity that we have today. So that really is the start of the U.S.'s government's role in it. And the whole genesis, the birth of this, can really be traced back to U.S. government research and development programs. But then what we did see in the United States, rather uniquely, as I think you're alluding to, is that it wasn't just Westinghouse who did the pressurized water reactor. We started to see two other major players, big fossil fuel companies, Combustion Engineering and Babcock and Wilcox, develop their own PWR technology. And then in this discussion, we had General Electric begin evolving their own PWR technology outside of the U.S. government. And then we also even had General Atomics in the United States, although we don't talk about this very often because we only built two of them, developed some high-temperature gas reactor plants, reactor designs, first at Peach Bottom Unit Number 1, and then at Fort St. Vrain in Colorado. And what's really unique about the United States, in some ways, in the history of nuclear power development, is because we don't have a national utility. We have the Tennessee Valley Authority, of course. We have the Bonneville Power Administration. We have some federal utilities. But most utilities are private companies or even state-owned companies or municipal-owned companies that serve a region. And there's no direct federal coordination of those activities. So what that allowed was each one of these utilities to choose sort of their favorite reactor technology and to choose the turbine manufacturer and to choose the contracting and engineering company that would then sort of integrate it and actually build all of these things at an actual power plant. And as a result, the U.S. nuclear fleet right now is highly non-standardized. I think it's actually probably the most non-standardized global fleet anywhere, even though it's the largest nuclear power fleet, where we have reactors of 4 different manufacturers of 2 different major types, with 6 or 7 different engineering firms that actually integrated those all together. And it's really this sort of, wonderful, diverse rainbow of nuclear steam supply systems and EPCs that integrated this all together. And I think that had some real strengths, but some real weaknesses too. And I think some of the quirks of the U.S. nuclear industry are sort of embedded in this approach.
Wow. So much to sort of to branch off from there. Of course, there's the joke about France having hundreds of different types of cheese and 2 types of reactors, 3 types of reactors, and the kind of inverse being true in the U.S. This kind of like buffet lunch approach. I mean, certainly when I look at the deployment of nuclear in China, it was let's try a whole bunch of different things, maybe, and see what works, and indigenize a reactor or 2, and maybe they're into a stage of kind of standardization. But clearly, this is a very different approach. I mean, why don't we talk a little bit about diving a little bit deeper into that? You mentioned this leads to some of the idiosyncrasies that we see in the modern nuclear power sector in the U.S. What was the impact of this? Did this mean, I mean, this sounds like an environment ripe for innovation, trying lots of new and different things, competition, that can have certainly positive impacts. Is nuclear different in that it doesn't benefit from that? I mean, there's critiques of the Soviet economic system just being terrible at innovation and just cranking out the same thing over and over again. A 1945 motorcycle basically still being produced and sold in the 90s. Make a lot of units, but they're all the same. What are some of your thoughts in terms of the strengths and weaknesses of that approach that the U.S. took?
So I think the strengths of it are, we really did get initially at least, a diverse nuclear sector, right? We did end up building, the United States is still the world's largest producer, of course, of nuclear electricity in terms of kilowatt hours generated. But, I think there were a lot of, the most basic question that you would ask is, okay, so now we've tried out, all sorts of different reactor types, all sorts of different manufacturers and models, even within those vendors. Who won, right? What's really fascinating is if you go into the data, what you find is that you can't really actually find a clear signal, right? What it turned out to be, which is so interesting to me in looking at this objectively, is that the management and sort of operations of the plants themselves turned out to be more important than the underlying nuclear steam supply system technology. So it's really hard right now to actually go into the performance data of all of these, so many different data points to actually show a clear winner. Even if you try to compete pressurized water reactors versus boiling water reactors, like maybe each year they sort of switch positions and they're off by a couple tenths of a percent on the capacity factors. And that was a really interesting lesson. What happened was the same fleet that we were struggling in the 70s to get above 65% capacity factor. When we put all of the money in, as the U.S. stopped building nuclear power plants, but really started operating nuclear power plants, we became some of the world's best operators of nuclear plants. And what we saw is the same reactors who 20 years ago or 40 years ago were operating at a 70% capacity factor, now operating at a 90% capacity factor. And that's really the sort of lesson that I take away from this, is that it's not as much of the underlying reactor technology, at least in this set of light water reactors that we have a lot of operational experience. It's learning how to operate them and getting that management and operational excellence that the nuclear industry, to its credit, has done an extraordinary job of being the most reliable, highest capacity factor by far source of generation in the United States generating portfolio. And so we just really didn't get a great signal. I think one of the lessons that we did learn is this came at a huge cost, though, for the United States. It's hard for us to appreciate just how unstandardized the U.S. nuclear fleet is. A perfect example of this, my favorite, is Arkansas Nuclear 1, which of course is a nuclear power plant, as we could guess, in Arkansas. And in that plant, we have unit number 1 is a Babcock's and Wilcox pressurized water reactor with the famous once-through steam generators with 2 reactor coolant pumps per loop. And unit number 2, right next to it in the same turbine building, and you look at them, they look at the identical plant, It's a combustion engineering pressurized water reactor. Totally different steam generator design, totally different instrumentation and control, so totally different standard, operating procedures and technical specifications. So the fleet is highly, highly non-standardized, and that really did prevent us, I think, from getting some of the learning curve aspects that we would expect of building, 100 plus power reactors and bringing them to operation. And I think the devastating example of this in builds was what happened in Washington State with the famous WPSS, right, or Washington Public Power Supply System, where this utility, which we call WPPSS, whimsically named WPSS, tried to build 5 nuclear power plants at 3 different sites using 3 different designs. They tried to build a Babcock and Wilcox pressurized water reactor, combustion engineering pressurized water reactors, and a General Electric boiling water reactor. And they failed completely, except for one of those plants, which is now known as Columbia Generating Station. The 4 out of the 5 plants that we started construction, and they're there, you can see the building, and they never finished. And it led to, at then, the largest municipal bond default in the United States history, with billions of dollars bonds defaulting, and still the second largest municipal bond default in history. And one of the lessons that you learn from that, talking to people on that project, my father was on that project as an engineer, is that one of the problems when you're using 3 different designs at 3 different sites, it's really, really hard to take the lessons that you learn from one reactor site and translate them to the next. You need 3 different supply chains, 3 different sets of engineers and drawings, 3 different workforces, all trained on it. And none of those lessons sort of were able to translate. And there were some attempts at standardization with something called SNUPS, which we ended up only building 2 plants on, standardized nuclear unit power plant systems. But to be honest with you, we, I think, paid a very big price in the first rollout of nuclear plants not to have standardization of any sort.
Whoops. Aptly named. And you're telling me in a sort of pre-recording conversation that this is truly kind of unprecedented. We did actually with the AP1000 units in summer. Did we see a similar municipal utility default? Is that kind of unique to nuclear?
Summer was a little complicated because you had both investor-owned utilities and municipal utilities participating in the project. But what we did see is that, the main project lead on Summer, right, defaulted. It doesn't exist anymore. It's called a company called Scana. It was actually bought in a fire sale. And we saw the CEO and the COO of that company go to jail, actually, for lying to the Public Service Commission about the status of that project. And to go to your broader point, one of the things that I think is the biggest challenge, although we don't talk about it very often as nuclear advocates or even inside the industry, I think sometimes, is the track record, as you were alluding to, of nuclear plants being in the United States sometimes utility killers. And one of the things that's really interesting about utilities, if you think about it, utilities very rarely go bankrupt because a power utility, they've got to often, especially in a vertically integrated or regulated utility, right? They have a sort of captive audience, right? They have a captive customer base, and you sort of always need power. Even in the midst of the deepest recessions, people still turn their lights on, they still cook dinner, they still heat their house or turn the air conditioning on or watch TV. And so we generally don't expect power utilities to go bankrupt or to disappear. But nuclear plants have been the exception to this in the United States. And the reason has to do a lot with the way that in the US we finance nuclear power projects. Because a nuclear power plant, one of the great benefits of it, has very low operating costs. Fuel costs are very little. It's really just paying the personnel, paying for the fuel and maintenance. But the capital cost, the cost of actually building the facility, is extremely high. Right? We're not talking about tens of billions of dollars for a new twin unit AP1000, for example. And historically, we're at that sort of price level when you adjust it for inflation. You need to raise that money from the bond markets to be able to do this. And investors who want to buy that bond don't want to just bet that nuclear project is going to succeed. They want to be protected even in the event that we don't complete that nuclear power plant. So what ends up happening is utilities issue bonds using something called system financing, where they pledge to service the bonds not just on the revenue generated by the nuclear power plant, but instead by the revenue of the entire company and the assets of the entire company, which means that if the power plant doesn't succeed or has major cost overruns, the entire company can be at risk. And historically, this has happened. As you brought up, it just happened a couple of years ago in South Carolina with Summer Units 2 and 3, with the AP1000s being built there, and the ratepayers are being forced to pay it. But historically, it's happened a bunch in the industry, right? We had Whoops that I talked about already, where we caused this massive municipal bond default. We had Seabrook Station, although we ended up bringing unit number 1 of Seabrook Station in New Hampshire online, that cost overruns that were associated with that plant bankrupted the Public Service of New Hampshire, which was the first investor-owned utility bankruptcy in U.S. history since the Great Depression. In Shoreham, in Long Island, where I actually grew up, right, we had a power plant called Shoreham that we built and actually finished and brought on to low power operation. But because of vehement anti-nuclear opposition and then, some conspiracies with, to be honest, the governor at the time of New York State, Mario Cuomo, it was never allowed to operate, which meant that the ratepayers of Long Island had to pay billions of dollars for a plant that never generated anything. And the utility that ordered it, some Long Island Lighting Company or Lilco, had to basically be destroyed, and a state-owned utility had to take it over. And the assets sold off. So nuclear, this is the one exception to utilities being like this safe, conservative, frankly, boring investment and place to work, is that nuclear plants have had this track record, unfortunately, of maybe threatening that.
Okay. Well, let's zoom back out and make sure that we're proceeding, I guess, from a kind of historical process through the decades.
Sure,
so
yeah.
This all informs it, right? Because I want to get at the issue of, what's behind
Maybe we probably have to cut it up a little bit.
No problem. What's behind the cost overruns? But let's kind of follow that history through. You went back to the 40s and 50s to get a sense of kind of the history of government involvement early on, and particularly in R&D. But what's happening 60s, 70s, 80s? I think a lot of people think that we stopped building nuclear around the time or just after 3 Mile Island, but I think there's a lot of inertia in the system. There's a lot of cancellations, but a lot of builds happen after. So just walk us through, from a 30,000 foot view, how that progresses, and when things kind of slow down and stop, and why, in your opinion, because there's so many competing hypotheses, and I'm sure a lot of them have different validity. But I'd love to hear your perspective.
So what happens is, in the late 50s, early 60s, we begin seeing these first demonstration plants come online, right? We see Shippingport in the late 50s, the first pressurized water reactor. We start seeing Dresden, unit number 1 on the boiling water reactor side. And these plants are generally pretty small. They're 50, 60, 70, sometimes 100 megawatts, 130 megawatts large. And what we start to see is that these are actually pretty attractive options. And so we start seeing utilities start ordering more and more plants. And we start seeing, as the technology matures, the size of these plants really start increasing. And we really start seeing going from a couple 100 megawatt plants all the way up to 500 to 600 to 700 to 800 to a gigawatt and a gigawatt plus throughout the 60s and early 70s. And what we start seeing is this sort of a little bit of, I don't want to call it mania, but real optimism on the utility side that nuclear plants allow an opportunity to generate power in any location that has a cooling water source, and then later even not that, in a way that doesn't depend on supply chains for fossil fuels. So this is really important for areas like New England and even New York State that don't have coal or oil or natural gas resources, at least conventionally. And we start seeing this maturity of the technology coincide with a couple of historical events. And the most important one of this was the oil embargo of 73. But right before that, you have to understand that during this time, there are huge theories about the finite supply that we had of fossil fuel resources. And, Hubbard, who was a geologist, came out with his Hubbard peak hypothesis in 1956, this idea that for oil, which was still actually, 15 to 20% of electric power was generated from burning or using oil as an energy source during this time, there was this idea that we're going to start running out of oil. that there would be peak oil, and that would be sort of on an inexorable decline in oil production. And although coal was a little bit, going to be a lot longer lasting, there was increases in the prices of coal going on at this time. So utilities looking to meet also a massive increase in electric power demand during this time in the United States, where we started really seeing the quality of life start increasing, those technological innovations really start translating to the home. Utilities were trying to chase and serve this demand and do it in a way that looked like something that would have a really cheap fuel source to do it. And nuclear was a natural sort of supply of power for that. And this, peaked in 1973 when we had the peak number of orders for new nuclear power plants placed in the United States. I believe in that single year, we placed over 100 orders for reactors just in 73. And 73, of course, was not just a really interesting time, in the United States historically, but it was also the year of the OPEC oil embargo and the year of the energy crisis. The idea, the United States, there were lines at gasoline stations starting to emerge, 73, 74, 75. So we really were in this place where we thought there was going to be a real energy crunch. And in fact, there was an energy crunch that was impacting people every single day. And utilities were trying to respond to this with a technology that could really actually achieve U.S. energy independence.
A couple things that I've heard rumors that maybe it was JFK, maybe it was Nixon talking about, in election platforms saying, we're going to transition the U.S. electricity system to be all nuclear. If the utilities don't move fast enough, we will get involved to force them. I think that was more on the JFK side. Nixon, again, these may be false attributions or completely made up quotes. What do you know about that?
No, it's not, right? That what I'm alluding to is actually by Nixon. It's called Project Independence, right? And it was announced on November 7th, 1973, right? And it was a commitment, as you said, to construct 1,000 nuclear power plants by year 2000 in the United States.
Can you imagine?
Right? And it was similar in some ways to the Mesmer plan in France that was announced at the exact same time, right? The only difference is the French followed through and the US, the Americans did not. Right? So we did actually have that announcement by Nixon in November of 73 in the midst of the OPEC oil embargo to basically build 1,000 reactors in the United States by year 2000.
So what ends up happening and why? You mentioned orders peak then, and then they crash pretty shortly thereafter.
Yeah. So a couple of things begin to happen in 73, 74, 75. First of all, we have a big DC district, DC Circuit Court decision come out called, I think it's Calvert Cliffs versus the National Resources Defense Council, NRDC, an anti-nuclear environmental group. And this was Calvert Cliffs, which is a nuclear power plant, a combustion engineering nuclear power plant in Maryland. And that basically said that the Atomic Energy Commission at the time had to basically take the National Environmental Policy Act much more seriously, and I'm hand-waving a little bit here, in the regulation of the environmental impacts of nuclear power plants. And this actually caused an 18-month pause in construction and new acceptances of operating licenses at that time by the AEC, by the predecessor of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So we started to see a real increase in regulations, even before the NRC was created, even during the time of the AEC, caused by environmental laws like the National Environmental Policy Act, which really started to change the economics of construction for nuclear power plants, coupled with a real environment of real inflation and labor shortages in the U.S. economy writ large. And when we talk about what a nuclear power plant, a large nuclear power plant construction looks like, it's thousands and thousands of people working at a single job site for a couple of years. And when we had dozens of reactors literally being constructed in the United States simultaneously during this time, we were seeing the impact of having both labor and supply shortages simultaneously really start slowing down the productivity of nuclear power construction sites going on. And this really started to change the economics of how nuclear power plants were being perceived as we tried to build them. And we just watched productivity, even before 3 Mile Island, really start plummeting at the plants in terms of how much percentage complete they got each year.
Yeah, it's fascinating on a number of levels. I mean, one of which is, where I'm at in Ontario, we're planning 6,000 megawatts of new build nuclear. I was sitting down with the head of the Ontario Building Trades the other day, and he was talking about some of the big infrastructure projects we've got going on, and the CEO of one of them saying, okay, so we're starting, this wasn't nuclear, just a transportation infrastructure job. We're going to start this light duty railroad project in October. And he said, no, you're not. And the guy said, why? What do you mean? Who are you to say this to me? He's like, you're not going to have the workers, right? Like, we need to carefully plan where we're putting our welders or steam fitters, everything else, and we don't have them for October. So that's, I think, something that often gets overlooked as we focus on blueprints and designs and all sorts of things. There's just, it's so many multifactorial, the kind of planning that goes into something like a power plant construction. But the question I had was, again, comparing this, Nixon's plan for a Mesmer plan versus the French. Do you think it was the lack of standardization that partially accounted for this? Because I'm thinking of, I'm not sure if it was at Chalou's. I remember seeing photographs of, one of the big heavy forging factories where they were banging out, 4 or 5 reactor pressure vessels every single year. That must have fit into, some state organization and planning and standardization. Do you think that had an impact on those shortages?
I think absolutely. I mean, what was really interesting about the way that, we had our forging capacity as well, primarily at Combustion in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and at Babcock's and Wilcox out in Indiana, was where we forged most of our own pressure vessels in the United States. And as we can imagine, we were not doing what the French were doing at this time, which was, the French literally came, as you may know, to Beaver Valley Nuclear Power Plant out in Pennsylvania, which is a Westinghouse 3 loop, and they copied that. And that was the basis of Fessenheim in France, right out by the German border. And that became the basis of the CPY, a standardized 900 megawatt electrical French fleet, which is the first real French pressurized water reactor. And we were not doing that. We were building 3, even the Westinghouse, product line. We were building 2-loop Westinghouse, 3-loop Westinghouse, 4-loop Westinghouses of all different power sizes, with all different engineering firms trying to do this. Whereas the French, with Framatome, with this joint venture initially with Westinghouse, we're basically building one plant and just copying it over and over and over again, only the most minor changes. That really did contribute a lot to, I think, the supply chain issues that we had, because the suppliers were having to make reactor pressure vessels of completely different types. Nuclear, qualified supply chain, we're making totally different types of valves, totally different types of pumps for each different plant. And that really did contribute to this overall crunch that I think started happening post-1975, when we really started the we saw the completion rate of nuclear power plants drop below 1% per month, right, of how much construction we were actually getting done at the facility. So I think that was the case, but I do think the inflationary environment in the United States really played a very large role, as well as just the labor crunch that we were seeing across the sector. This coupled also with the steps in the United States that had to be taken by the Federal Reserve to crunch down inflation. We started increasing interest rates very, very significantly, which meant the capital costs, because we were privately financing them on the capital markets, these are bonds that are tied to those underlying interest rates, it suddenly became a lot more expensive to build a nuclear power plant, even if none of the actual costs changed on the underlying plant. The so-called overnight costs remained constant, right? Just the cost of financing it became much, much more expensive. And then remember, although we think about 3 Mile Island as this time when we stopped ordering nuclear power plants, which was in 1979, if you actually look at the historical record, 3 Mile Island was in April of 79. The last orders really were in 1978 for new plants. So even in that couple months of 79, no utility was placing an order. And we do see a dramatic drop even before TMI. And TMI sort of added this perfect storm element with the NRC.
But I mean, that's interesting because, the kind of death of the nuclear industry in terms of new orders happened prior to the bogeyman that most people think of in terms of 3 Mile Island and the NRC. Before we jump to that, though, one other idiosyncrasy, I think Chris Adelum brought this to my attention, and we see this in France, in Japan, in Ontario, nuclear sites with 4, 6, 8 reactors. I think an idiosyncrasy of the U.S. system, as I understand it, is there's a fair number of single and just 2-unit sites. I think there's several that have 4 units now. But in general, for such a large country with such a large grid, we don't see single sites with 5, 6, 7, 8 reactors on them as we do in these other jurisdictions. Is that again a product of?
We only have one site that has 4 units, and that's Vogel, right, which has Vogel 1 and 2 that were built in, finished in the 80s, and then 3 and 4, obviously, that are just coming online now. We have a couple of 3-unit plants, Palo Verde, Oconee, right? We have kind of quasi ones like Fitzpatrick and 9 Mile Point. But yes, we don't have very many large 4 or 6 or 8 units like you guys have a lot in Canada, just to be honest. And I think that is a little bit of a byproduct, as I said, about the financing issues that we had, right? If you have a much easier way to finance a nuclear power plant, right, it doesn't require you issuing tens of billions of dollars of debt simultaneously, right? Building a 4 or 8 unit nuclear power plant makes a lot of sense because you can slide along and apply those lessons learned to the next reactor, to the next reactor, to the next reactor, and that labor force that you brought in can kind of stay there and sort of slide along as each unit progresses down the line. And this has been associated, even in those 2 and 3 unit plants, even at Vogel 3 and 4, we saw a pretty large reduction with how much Vogel 4 costs versus what Vogel 3 costs. But the problem is in the US, putting yourself on the line for financing 4 nuclear power plants simultaneously, no one has ever done it. I mean, Whoops tried to do it with 5, I guess, at 3 different sites, and that blew up in their face. And so this issue with how do you raise the capital and put your company at risk to even do the most economically efficient approach, which would, as you had suggested, really doing what the Canadians or sometimes the French do, and building these large, 6 or 8 unit plants, just didn't happen in the United States. And it's one of the downsides I think we have from having a less state-involved enterprise. But I will say on the flip side, right? TVA, it's not like Tennessee Valley Authority, which is a U.S. government institution. They built 1 3-unit reactor plant, which is Browns Ferry, but they didn't build a huge number of multi-unit plants. So I think it was a little bit also, just to be honest, what really happened at Whoops was the idea, why they chose 3 different plant designs was they thought they were going to figure out which one was the best.
Right.
And then the second fleet would, the second orders would be of that one design. And I think that's a lot of what these utilities in the 60s and 70s thought they were doing. They're kind of prototyping out, seeing which reactor worked best, and then the next ones may have been those mega 5 or 6 unit plants. But we just never got to that point.
Interesting. I mean, we've been slinging a bit of mud. We've brought up Vogel. We talked about Whoops. Let's talk about, what are the shining examples of really great builds that have happened in the States. I think when we were, in our pre-recording conversation, you mentioned Palo Verde as being maybe the shining gem of, American nuclear construction and really operations, and also just building this plant in a desert without, an obvious source of water cooling. If we could take a moment to go into that, if indeed you agree that is, maybe the shining example of American nuclear construction.
I think one of the weird sometimes we're a little bit almost schizophrenic about how nuclear power works in the United States. It's always been a disaster, or while the construction has always been a disaster, while we're so glad that we have it. But the real truth is, if you look into the history of the individual plant builds, there's many examples of very, very successful nuclear plant builds. And what I love about Palo Verde is a couple of really interesting quirks about it. The first is that Palo Verde's entire construction process was overseen by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Right? The construction permit for Palo Verde was granted by the NRC, which meant that the entire nuclear construction was done by the regulated by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And just so for listeners who aren't aware of this, in 1974, we had an organization called the Atomic Energy Commission that both was in charge of promoting nuclear energy, among other things, and regulating it. And the Nixon administration, and then Ford actually ended up signing this, decided it would be maybe prudent to split those 2 functions to the Department of Energy and to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And so a lot of U.S. nuclear power plants, the initial construction permits, in some cases the operating licenses, were granted by the AEC rather than the NRC. But in Palo Verde, we have this interesting example where the NRC was really in charge. There's a couple other examples of the entire process. And the interesting thing about the NRC, about Palo Verde, is it was a new reactor design by combustion engineering called the System 80. And that design, as you may know, laid the foundation for the very successful Korean nuclear power fleet, which is all derivatives of that System 80, the OPR 1000 and the APR 1400. And that entire safety review was done by the NRC. So the NRC really held this entire thing. throughout its entire process, including giving the operating license and the safety analysis acceptance for a totally novel reactor. And we had, in the middle of Palo Verde, we had the 3 Mile Island accident happen in 79. Construction permits granted in 75. We're in the middle of construction in 79. And not to mention, the last thing is, until Vogtle gets finished, Palo Verde was and is the America's largest nuclear power plant in the middle of the desert in Arizona, hundreds of miles away from a large body of water. It uses treated sewage water to make the cooling water blow down. And all of these factors, if you think about it independently, should lead to a project disaster. It's a mega 3-unit plant by a utility. Arizona Public Service has never built a nuclear power plant before, never operated one. It's in the middle of the desert. It's near no shipping lanes to get the barge in the components. It's in the middle of this terrible regulatory morass that happens with the NRC after 3 Mile Island. And yet, despite this turns out to be one of the most successful nuclear power plant builds in the U.S. history, right? Where we build basically unit number 1s and unit number 2 for about $6 billion a piece in inflation-adjusted dollars. I don't know what unit 3 costs. We don't actually have data on unit 3 because the Department of Energy stopped reporting on that. And we saw massive price reductions between each unit 1 and unit number 2 and unit number 3. And although it took about a decade to get online, we brought 2 gigawatts from 1975 construction start to 1986 in rapid succession back online. And unit number 3 starts in 1988. So we really had a relatively good build out that was very, very affordable. If we could just replicate what happened at Palo Verde in the United States today, I think we would be seeing utilities line up to build nuclear power plants. If you could get that amount of power, that amount of reliable, clean baseload power for that price, this would be a totally different environment than we're operating in today. And what I like about Palo Verde, just to end, is that all the factors that worked against Palo Verde are actually, I would argue, maybe controversially, easier today than they were then. And I think that's the lesson I take from Palo Verde, is that we can do it if we really focus on it and put the right pieces on them.
So you mentioned all the challenges. What was the secret sauce? How did they supersede all those challenges? How did they get done?
There's actually some really great papers on this. A group called Highbridge Associates did actually a write-up of a consulting group about what actually went right at Palo Verde among other plants. But it was really a very, very tight integrated project sort of delivery. Before that was a buzzword between the utility, Arizona Public Service, the nuclear steam supply system vendor, Combustion Engineering, who provided the reactor and the engineer and the associated sort of steam generators and reactor coolant pumps, and the construction firm, which was Bechtel. And they all worked incredibly closely together. Bechtel built an entire scale model of Palo Verde. This was before really 3D computer-aided design really came into the main form. So they were able to see, even before they began construction, how every single little piece fit together really, really well. They did just general amazing supply chain sort of simplification procedures. For example, they used all nuclear grade components, even for systems that didn't require nuclear grade components. Even though that was much more expensive, the EPC in cooperation with Bechtel, in cooperation with APS, noticed that actually it was more expensive to make sure that you didn't integrate in a non-nuclear grade component into something that needed a nuclear grade component than just making everything nuclear grade. They had very, very clear management structures of how they were going to deal with change control over the entire project life cycle. And most importantly, I think the one lesson that we've learned universally is they finished every element of the design before they began construction. And that really allowed them to do that planning and resource-loaded scheduling way, way before that. And they also had real great cooperation as all three when they were going up with the NRC due to that regulatory changes that were happening due to 3 Mile Island.
Right. I think you've already answered this, but you mentioned this strategy. We'll move on from Palo Verde now. I just want to kind of tie a few knots here. That's the right saying. I think you answered this, but essentially, there was this approach of let's try and build a whole bunch of different stuff, see what works best. Operationally, the U.S. fleet, I mean, there's been obviously been some branches of reactor development. You mentioned the high temperature gas reactors that didn't pan out, but in terms of the fleet we have, the majority of the reactors we built operationally, they're all doing pretty well. They're all hitting cap factors in the 90s. Is that correct? Are they all?
Yeah, the U.S. fleet is, I think, the highest performing fleet by country. And maybe there's, I think maybe Romania with their can-dos may actually be, their two Canada's maybe beating us a little bit year to year. But, for as large and as diverse of a fleet, we are averaging above 90% capacity factors year after year after year. And we're increasingly getting even better than that as we increase the refueling outage lengths, cycle lengths from 18 months to 24 months. And then maybe as LEU Plus comes online even longer than that, although we don't know about that. So the capacity factors are even really going up even still a little bit now. It's truly exceptional what has happened there. And that is a testament, I think, and one of the nuclear industry's most proud achievements, because before 3 Mile Island, right, the capacity factor of the fleet couldn't breach 60%. And if you look what happened after 1979, it's like right after 3 Mile Island, actually, we just see literally it's like a cliff. Just the capacity factors skyrocket. And there's a combination of factors that are driving this. One is obviously operational experience. We started to have operated PWRs and BWRs for a couple of years, but kind of learned their quirks. But also, the industry itself started to organize the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations, which was originally created actually in response by the industry after TMI as a safety case. But in addition to, I think, dramatically increasing the safety of the operating fleet, really excelled at getting operational excellence really out of the fleet and really sharing best practices across utilities and across different reactor types. We also saw empowerment of what are called the owners groups. So for combustion engineering PWRs, we have a group, the Combustion Engineering Owners Group, Babcock's, each one of them, and they started really working alongside EPRI, the Electric Power Research Institute, on this real project of how do we really get the most out of these plants. And the regulator, in the case of the NRC after TMI, made very, very clear that they expected operational excellence, and they would not tolerate anything less than operational excellence. And that obviously was controversial, and in some cases drove up the price of the operating fleet. But it also made clear that things like unplanned scrams or unplanned power changes that were necessary due to maintenance reasons or preventable causes were going to really negatively impact your rating with the safety regulator and would have regulatory consequences. So the industry, to its immense credit, really got together and said, we're going to solve this problem, and did. And I often, sometimes in my dreams, wish that we would take the same approach to construction now.
Yeah.
And that say we really, it's a grand slam what the industry was able to do. And it really was the industry who mainly did this. And there's some government funding to do this, some national lab support, but it really was EPRI and INPO, really working to make operational excellence the norm. And that really has transformed the entire fleet. And I think we could do the same thing with construction.
I'm inspired. Not that I have anything to do with engineering and construction, but it's a good story. I've heard this called the age of the operator, and I think it's pretty extraordinary when you think about these capacity factors being stuck in the 60s, not just in the 1960s, but in the 60% range. It's almost like adding like 40 more kind of ghost units to the U.S. fleet. We're seeing that in Canada with, this is not so much operator dependent, but adding kind of uprates, upgrading our turbines, et cetera. It's like building a new CANDU at Bruce Power, just in terms of what we can squeeze out of those units. I think that's pretty extraordinary. But getting back to this,
it's not just even on the capacity factor. It's on the uprates that we've been super successful in getting the uprates, but also even maintenance activities like steam generator replacement, where we've just made enormous strides in how long it takes to replace steam generators for pressurized water reactors. People say the nuclear industry hasn't learned, it's stuck in the 50s, it's stuck in the 60s. All I say is, look at what we're doing with the operating fleet. And if you're not inspired, I don't know what you're not looking at the same data set that I'm looking at. Like, this is an industry that took a real challenge, was in the mud, stuck in the mud, and hit it out of the ballpark.
So in terms of, those growing pains of getting up, getting this operational excellence up, getting the uprates happening, I mean, I think that's instructive when talking about the future of U.S. nuclear with, a lot of, I think, ideas around, well, the existing fleet's not good enough, it's not safe enough, it's not technologically advanced, it's not advanced nuclear, that, new designs are going to solve some of the problems, whether they're purely sort of aesthetic or, non-technical, but, new designs are going to kind of leap to the rescue. And one of my concerns is always, well, it's going to take a while to master that technology, as it did with the PWR and BWR fleet. Is that true, or have we learned enough about how to?
I think it is true, but let me give you the bull's case for nuclear right now in the United States, which I don't think we talk about enough.
Sure,
and I think you're hitting something right on the hammer on the nail, right? So the first thing is one of the big problems is, I think we've kind of been alluding around, is what happened after 3 Mile Island with the NRC. And I think a lot of the historical hatred of the NRC stems out of this, right? What happened in the NRC was, under the old licensing process, or it's still on the books, and some people are going to use it now again, called Part 50. The way that you built a nuclear power plant is you got a construction permit, and you do some preliminary safety analysis, and preliminary design specifications would be in that, as part of that grant to that construction permit. But in order to basically get what we called an operating license, you would apply mid-construction. And the NRC would apply the current regulatory standards to granting an operating license, which meant that when you started the design of the plant, the regulations may have changed in the middle of you constructing it. And we have these issues where literally a power plant system would be built at a nuclear plant in the United States, and then the regulations would change after that construction was already done. And the engineers would have to come back and destroy that and rebuild it to comply with the new regulations. And this was already a problem before 1979, after 3 Mile Island, where we changed, depending on your estimate, between a quarter and a third of all the regulations regulating new nuclear power plant construction. This became a crisis. And it was a massive, massive driver of cost overruns and schedule overruns in the 80s of new nuclear power plants. And we did learn from that. And that was why Palo Verde is so, Palo Verde St. Lucie Unit Number 2, these builds are so exceptional, is because they were able to get through that. And despite an impossible regulatory situation, we're still relatively on time and on budget. That's extraordinary. But we did get a new regulatory pathway starting in 87, 88 called Part 52, which allows everything in the plant license to be done before construction even begins. It's called a combined construction operating license. And even better than that, we have in that license that is granted the sets of tests, what we call ITACs, or inspections, test, analyses, and acceptance criteria, that are going to be used to prove to the NRC that actually you built the plant in conformance with what the license said. So there's nothing that can change in the middle of construction once you get that operating license. And this was battle tested. We got that now, right? We didn't have that then. We have now, in the case of Vogtle, let me go back to where you were going, and I'm sorry if I took us off. We now have, through Vogtle 3 and Vogtle 4, we've actually gone through that process all the way to the end. And we have a regulator that's familiar with the design, and we have a standardized design. We have the AP1000, which has a standardized design certification. And we can really copy that plant and standardize that AP1000 that we built, that's now fully designed, that has a mature supply chain. And we can copy it, and we can know that the exact same regulatory standards will be applied as they were applied at Vogtle. And that, in my mind, going back to this sort of lesson that I think we can extract from it, that's not so much how fancy the technology is, how cool the technology is. It's the more human aspect of how familiar the workforce is with it, how mature the design is, how mature the supply chain is, how much we know the quirks for lack of a better term, of the construction that don't ever appear until you actually get a work team out on a work phase trying to put it together in reality. We have that in a design, and we have, for the first time, I think, in the history of the US nuclear industry, a regulatory process that can be replicated in a predictable manner. And that is, I think, a really bull's case for nuclear in the United States that we don't talk about. And there's a really big reason why we don't talk about it. I don't know, did that answer your question?
I think so, yeah.
I was trying to get to it. I went a little bit around.
No problem at all. I mean, I think it was intriguing, that idea of taking, what the nuclear industry's knocked it out of the park on in terms of operational excellence, sharing information, these owners groups, et cetera. I guess, and this gets into sort of the political side, and again, the role of government in this. When talking about learning construction excellence, that implies that there's some cohesive plan to build multiple units across the country. And I think that's where we start to get into difficulties with the U.S. system in terms of having a whole number of different utilities, some regulated, some, I won't call them deregulated, but differently regulated. I think that seems to me to be the challenge to sort of, this Mesmer 2.0 with the AP 1000.
So I think, one of the interesting things that we don't talk about is the first nuclear renaissance, which is where we got Vogtle and Summer actually built. But in addition to Vogtle and Summer, right, the NRC granted licenses to close to a dozen additional new nuclear power plants around the country. And we still actually have those licenses active today in Michigan, in Virginia, in South Carolina, and in Florida, right? So hypothetically, if we could get a utility, like say Florida Power and Light or DTE, to order, to want to actually build another nuclear power plant in Florida, we have a site that has a license that the NRC could say, basically, you can start construction tomorrow. Same thing with the ESBWR. Obviously, we've never built them before in Detroit or outside of North Anna Unit Number 3. The question, I think, is, and we've seen much more since my life. I'm 32. I've never seen the United States as pro-nuclear as it is today. The Inflation Reduction Act, although it had a lot of money for renewables, wind and solar, it really does have a huge amount of money for new nuclear as well as existing nuclear. And we have a huge amount of money available at the Loans Program Office to guarantee new nuclear power projects. I think the question we need to be asking is, why aren't utilities ordering the plants, or even the plants where they've already gone through the licensing process and literally have gotten that license and have that license, why aren't they constructing that plant now? And I hate to say it, but I think the answer is the pink elephant in the room, which is Vogtle and Summer, right? We thought that we were going to have this marvelous new design, the AP 1000, which was greatly simplified compared to a predecessor pressurized water reactor. And we had it modularized. The most modularized nuclear power plant that has ever been built is the AP 1000. And the results were frankly a disaster, as we all know, for that construction. And of course, I'm here saying the right thing to do is, please, sir, give me another, right? It's like literally we got to go back and do it again. But I think we as an industry and an advocacy community have not talked enough about what happened there and about why actually it will likely never happen again if we stick to it. The problem, I think, is that rather than us talking about it, to your initial question that you asked me, we're sort of hand-waving around it. We're saying we have these marvelous new small modular reactors that are going to solve all of these issues, even though many of the same issues that came up in those plant builds, I think are going to could happen again with the SMRs. And I think just like the lesson of operating excellence was not getting the best technology, it was doing the human fact, the putting the organizations together, sharing information, doing the same thing, standardizing operating procedures. In my mind, the thing that we need to do as the US is figure out a way that we can actually repeat the same lessons, the same designs over and over again. So those lessons we learned the hardest possible way now get translated over.
I'm feeling you, brother. I mean, up here in Canada, we're, neck deep in our CANDO refurbishments, $26 billion infrastructure projects, looking at refurbishing almost our entire fleet. And hopefully Pickering will be joining that, 4 of its 8 reactors. And we have this tremendous momentum, supply chain coordination. We're, unlike Vogel, we're on budget ahead of schedule with these refurbs. But there's still this opportunity to fumble this baton, which should be seamlessly passed between refurb and new build. In terms of Vogel, things are basically wrapped up there. What's happening to that supply chain and workforce? Have they already diluted too quickly? That was the issue with Vogel, right? Is that anyone who had built a nuclear plant was already in a retirement home and couldn't really be there to help move along the construction. That seems to me to be what I argue in Canada is this is not a $26 billion investment just in these vital clean energy assets. It's a $26 billion investment in human beings, in people, in human capacity, and institutional excellence. That seems to be what's at stake if we
right.
Preach, brother. Or maybe I already have, but
I really think that the big crisis that we face in the United States right now is that Vogel 4 just tacked out, that term I used before about it just passed all of its inspections and tests saying that we built it in compliance with the license. And it's ready, we'll get permission, I imagine, in the next couple of weeks to load fuel and begin, the testing, that aspect of testing before it can go critical. The problem, as you just said, is that we have a massive workforce now and a supply chain that was built. And boy, it failed a bunch of times, but we finally got it to work. And although some of that supply chain is going to be deployed now for the AP1000s that we're hopefully going to build in Poland, I think the biggest challenge that we have today is how do we build another AP1000 in the United States? Now, you might sound, Westinghouse is not paying for me. Cameco is not paying for me. Brookfield, I wish, hey, brother, I'll send you my address, send me a check. But, the real truth is, even though it's not maybe my favorite reactor design, having that real world experience of having a workforce, a supply chain, and having a design that is not only finalized, but we built it. You can go and walk in the building and say that steel beam is there, that piping, that cable raceway is organized this way. That is a killer asset. And what we are, unfortunately, what I'm scared about is that we're letting that dilute away in the hopes that the next technology is just going to magically have engineered away the very human challenges that are associated with the deployment of a new technology. And I don't think we can actually engineer that away. And I think the SMRs, as much as I think SMRs are really, really important and have huge applications all across the world, I am a little bit perplexed by the idea that SMRs are really going to be a great solution for a grid like the United States, or frankly, like Canada, where we have gigawatts and gigawatts and gigawatts of clean energy that we need to generate. And even if you assume a huge role for wind and solar, right? If we're going to come close to reaching our decarbonization goals, we need hundreds of gigawatts of new nuclear in the United States. That's not, those economies of scale are really, really profound. That's why we were scaling up the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I don't really understand the argument that we're trying to do with SMRs.
Right. And I think we're going to have to cut it here, and we're going to have a follow-up episode because we've really delved into maybe the past and the present. We have lessons for the future to draw from here. We tried to keep it to an hour. But maybe just before we go, as a kind of teaser, why is it, again, I've said this a number of times, I'm not as informed as you by any means, but my impression is that 15 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago, if you'd said the future of nuclear is to go small, to abandon economies of scale, and let's just bet on economies of multiples, and that the modularization only applies to small things, etc. I think you would have been called a bit crazy if you thought that was the future of the nuclear industry. Certainly if you'd gone back to the 80s, 90s or whatever, right? But what is it about the nuclear industry that has jumped onto a hype train, and where, I think our voices here questioning some of the sort of panacea of SMRs are heterodox voices. And frankly, there's a lot of it, hey, could you shut up about that, please, coming from the industry people that I talk to, or some pressure that I feel from the associations. This kind of tendency to kind of move in lockstep towards the next big thing, or in this case, the next small thing. I'm not sure if you can comment on that. You're kind of pretty outside of the industry, other than maybe your parental connections, but just culturally, that's a kind of personal curiosity that I have.
I think there's a couple things going on, actually back in 2010, before Vogel and Summer went south in any stretch of the imagination. Actually, my father testified. He was the lead expert for the United States Congress on SMRs, and his argument for the SMRs, before SMRs, as you noted, were really that big of a deal in 2010, his argument for why SMRs were going to play a really big role is that financing issue that I spoke about earlier.
Yes.
It's not financing in the classical way that you think about, can you raise money or not? Of course you can raise the money. Of course you can get a loan guarantee actually for this entire project. But the problem is you're betting your entire company on a large multi-gigawatt plant, as the way the AP1000s or an ESBW or ABWR would be financed. And when you look back, and when the utility executive looks back at what happened in the 80s and 90s with Shoreham and Seabrook and Whoops, and then when they saw what happened at Summer, right? All of a sudden, even if the power that's going to be generated from the plant is more expensive on an SMR, the overall cost, because it is, as its name implies, much smaller, that issue makes it more attractive. Just by the total price tag is smaller. We're not betting the entire shop on this. If this thing fails, it's going to be obviously not great. If it's going to go way over budget, not great. But it's unlikely to to be an existential corporate risk to the company. And that is very different than building another AP1000. Let's just be frank, right? An AP1000 brought already down. We only tried building 4 of them, and 2 of them brought down a utility with them. The other issue, I think, is it allows you to hand wave. It allows us to not talk about what really happened at Vogtle in Summer. And it allows us to say, don't even worry about, don't even think about that. We have new technology that will solve all the problems.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's where we're going to leave it for now. I think that's a great teaser for our next episode, where we'll look at the future a little bit more. We'll deep dive this SMR topic. Thank you so much, James. It's really a pleasure meeting you. As I said, I had no idea who you were. No one
knows who I am.
A little bit of Twitter. Okay. That's a beautiful thing. That's about to change fast, my friend. You're decouple famous now. So thanks for joining us. Thank you, listeners.
From your mouth to God's ears.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you for joining us. And listeners, thank you for listening. Please do support us on Patreon and subscribe, review, all that stuff. We will see you next week.
Thank you so much.